since 19. April 1945, the war had turned against them, and everyone in the room knew it. Yet still, duty was duty, and the men in lab coats at the Luftwaffe experimental facility outside Berlin had orders to carry out. The charred wreckage of the American P-51 Mustang had been delivered the night before, shot down over eastern Germany. At first glance, it looked like just another downed enemy aircraft. Bullet holes through the wings, blackened fuselage, and the smell of burnt metal. But this one had something different, something that drew their attention instantly. Large cylindrical tanks slung beneath the wings. They called them Abwurf tanks, or drop tanks. The German scientists gathered around it with a mix of curiosity and quiet dread. Dr. Helmut Kruger, a thin man with nervous eyes behind round spectacles, had been tasked with leading the analysis. He stood silently for a moment, staring at the tanks as two soldiers carefully detached them. "This isn't standard," muttered Kruger, brushing his hand across the scorched aluminum. He and his team had seen countless Mustangs before, but this one had flown deeper than most, much deeper. The logs from the Luftwaffe ground station said it had been part of a squadron spotted over Berlin the previous morning. Berlin, the very heart of the Reich. Kruger's assistant, Vogel, was already opening one of the tanks, taking measurements. "It's light," he said. "Completely empty now, but the internal coating suggests it held fuel, not water." "Of course it did," Kruger replied. "It's an auxiliary fuel tank." He stepped back, calculating in his head. The standard range of a Mustang was already formidable, but with this much additional fuel, it could fly far beyond what German intelligence had believed possible. He scribbled notes in his worn leather notebook, his hand shaking slightly. "They flew from England," Kruger said, more to himself than anyone else. "Crossed the Channel, deep into German airspace, hit Berlin, and returned." "But that's over 1,000 kilometers one way," Vogel said. "Even with extra fuel, that's—" "Impossible," Kruger snapped. "Clearly not," he motioned toward the engineers to begin disassembling the engine. But his mind was still on the tanks. He paced around the plane, lips tight, eyes distant. The implications hit him like a winter wind. They had believed the Reich capital was out of reach from escort fighters. That belief had formed the core of their defensive strategy. Bombers were expected, of course. They always came. But they were supposed to come alone, vulnerable to interceptors like the Messerschmitts. The Americans had changed the game. As the evening shadows grew long and the others went about their work, Kruger stayed beside the Mustang. He looked at the swastika armband on his uniform, then back at the dead aircraft, and for a moment he felt something strange. Not fear, not anger, respect. "This machine," he said softly, "it was never meant just to fight. It was meant to reach us, to find us where we thought we were safe." Vogel looked at him, frowning. "What do we report to command?" Kruger hesitated, then said, "We tell them the truth, that the Americans can reach Berlin with fighters, that our skies no longer protect us." He didn't say what he truly felt, that it was already over, that this Mustang, wrecked and broken on German soil, had just proven how wrong they'd been all along. The Reich hadn't just lost air superiority, it had lost the illusion of distance. The next morning came cold and gray, with smoke still hanging in the sky from last night's bombing. Berlin was a city bleeding from every corner, and inside, the underground facility, the Mustang's remains sat like a warning wrapped in steel. Dr. Kruger hadn't slept. He stood over a table now, going through the internal data plates and radio wiring pulled from the cockpit. His hands moved with precision, but his mind was elsewhere. racing through possibilities, timelines, fears. Vogel entered the lab carrying fresh documents. "Intercept reports," he said, dropping them on the table. "More Mustangs were seen over Leipzig. And Dresden. They're everywhere now." Kruger didn't look up. "They're not just everywhere. They're coordinated." He had realized something during the night that made his stomach twist. This Mustang had flown all the way from England, yes, but not just as an escort. The damage patterns, the gun residue on the wings, and the charred remains of 3 German trucks near its crash site. It hadn't just protected bombers. It had attacked targets on its own. "It operated independently," Kruger murmured. "It fought, it strafed, and it made it back as far as the Elbe River." Vogel leaned closer. "You're saying it wasn't just backup?" "I'm saying it was a spear." There was a silence between them. Outside, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. The Soviet front was pressing in from the east, but now it felt like the sky itself was collapsing from the west. Kruger walked to the fuselage again, where the Mustang's faded nose art was still barely visible under soot and grime. A pin-up girl sitting on a bomb, with the name Lucky Mary painted beneath. It was almost childish, mocking even. But it had crossed 1,000 kilometers of hostile airspace, dropped death onto German soil, and nearly escaped. He didn't say it aloud, but he envied the Americans for building such a machine. Behind him, the door opened. A man in black uniform entered, SS Hauptsturmführer Albrecht Weber, cold, stiff, and always watching. "I hear you found something interesting," Weber said, voice sharp as broken glass. Kruger turned, nodding. "Yes, sir." The Mustang carried extended range tanks, custom-mounted. With those, it reached Berlin airspace and returned. This is not isolated. Reports confirm others have done the same. Weber glanced at the wreckage, unimpressed. "A fuel tank doesn't win a war." "No," Kruger said carefully, "but reach does. And they now have it. Our defensive assumptions are broken." Weber stepped forward, examining the wreck like it was a dead animal. "And what do you suggest we do? Cry to Berlin? They're already burning." Kruger swallowed his frustration. "We need to prepare for an airspace without safety. The next time they come, they'll come heavier, deeper, perhaps even alone. Bombers, fighters, it won't matter. They can now choose the time and place." Weber didn't respond. He looked down at the aircraft again, then back at Kruger. "Destroy everything when you're done. Burn it. Photograph nothing. This doesn't leave this room." Kruger stared at him. "Why?" "Because if word spreads," Weber said with a tight smile, "panic spreads with it. And in case you haven't noticed, Doctor, we're not in a position to afford panic." He turned and left without waiting for a response. The lab felt colder now, not because of the weather, though the air creeping through the concrete walls was sharp, but because of the weight of what they'd discovered. Kruger had kept quiet all day, saying little to Vogel or the others. He'd done his job, written his report, and locked it in the drawer knowing full well it would never reach high command. Not in its full form. Weber would bury it, like they buried everything that didn't fit the fantasy of victory. By late evening, Vogel broke the silence. "There's more here," he said, nodding toward the stripped fuselage. "Something in the radio wiring. It's not German, not British either. American-made, but custom." Kruger finally stood up. "Show me." Together, they crouched by the open panel, where charred wires twisted like veins. At the center was a strange little box, black and scorched, but intact. Vogel had pulled it free and laid it on the table earlier. No label, no frequency markings, just a solid piece of work. "Encrypted transmitter," Kruger said, running his fingers over the edges. but short range, tactical. Vogel frowned. Then why hide it like this? Kruger didn't reply at first. He took a small tool and began gently prying the box open. Inside, among the coils and copper plates, something glinted. A small chip, too small. He blinked, then blinked again. "This isn't standard issue," he said. "It's too advanced." Vogel leaned closer, eyes wide. "You're saying this is new? New, or not meant to be seen?" They both looked at each other. This Mustang hadn't just flown farther. It had communicated something, sent data, perhaps reconnaissance, coordinates. It was part of something bigger. Kruger felt a chill in his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This was a test run," he whispered. "You mean?" "I mean," Kruger said slowly, "this aircraft wasn't just attacking. It was mapping, gathering, marking." Vogel's voice dropped. "For what?" Kruger stood straight, his eyes haunted. "For something bigger. A larger strike. Strategic." And then it hit him. The bombings in Berlin the night before. Not factories, not military posts, but bridges, rail lines, communication hubs. The Americans weren't just hurting the Reich, they were cutting it into pieces. He turned suddenly, grabbing a map from the wall and slamming it onto the table. His finger traced a line from the English coast to Berlin, then down toward Dresden and up again. A triangle, clean, efficient, precise. "They're carving corridors," he muttered. "Creating air lanes through us." Vogel looked alarmed. "But why?" "Because," Kruger said, looking down at the Mustang again, "they're preparing to finish this. Quickly. Brutally." There was a sharp knock on the door. Both men froze. Not Weber. He didn't knock. A young soldier stepped in, pale and nervous. "Herr Doctor, you're being summoned to Berlin. Immediate transport. Orders signed by General Feldmarschall Keitel himself." Kruger's breath caught. "Me?" "Yes, sir, and bring your findings." The soldier left before Kruger could ask anything else. Vogel stared. "You think they know?" Kruger nodded slowly. "No one sends a scientist from a back lab to Berlin in the middle of an invasion, unless they're desperate." He looked down at the wreck one last time. "What do I do with all this?" Vogel asked quietly. "Keep quiet. Hide what you can. If the war ends soon, burn the rest. And if it doesn't," Kruger gave him a long look, "then pray that next time, Lucky Mary doesn't fly alone." The train to Berlin was nearly empty. Kruger sat alone in a dimly lit compartment, the black case beside him carrying fragments of the Mustang and every note he had made. His hands trembled as the train rattled through the countryside, but not from cold. It was dread, the kind that crept in slowly, like a leak in a sinking ship. Outside the window, the once proud villages of the fatherland now looked tired. Roofs caved in, smoke still curling from chimneys that had no warmth left to give. Every mile closer to Berlin felt like a descent into the belly of something dying. The soldiers on the platform had told him nothing, just that General Feldmarschall Keitel had called for him personally. That in itself was terrifying. Scientists weren't summoned like this, not unless someone important had finally noticed what he had tried to whisper in those buried reports. When the train arrived in Berlin, it was after midnight. The city was a ghost. Sirens moaned in the distance. Smoke lingered in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. Buildings leaned, burned, collapsed. The war had hollowed the capital from the inside out. A black staff car waited for him. Two officers, silent, led him through deserted streets, past barricades and artillery posts manned by boys too young to shave. The car stopped at a heavily guarded command bunker near the Tiergarten, deep underground, where the air was dry and cold. Kruger was led into a room that looked more like a war hospital than a command center. Maps on every wall, radios buzzing, officers whispering with tight faces and tired eyes. Then Keitel entered. The man looked aged beyond his years, shoulders rigid, but soul sagging under the weight of collapse. His eyes fixed on Kruger like a hawk. "You're the one who examined the downed Mustang?" "Yes, General Feldmarschall. You confirmed it reached Berlin from England. And returned." "Yes, sir. The drop tanks made it possible." Catel nodded grimly. "And yet, no one in high command thought it mattered. Until yesterday." He pointed toward a table. There, laid out in grim silence, were aerial photographs. Dozens of them. Grainy but clear. Berlin's key infrastructure, railway hubs, and military choke points. Marked, circled, tagged in American code. Kruger stared in disbelief. These are from the Mustang?" "No, these are from 20 others like it," Keitel said. "We intercepted a crash near Leipzig, found an intact camera system, and radio data. Your theory was correct." Kruger felt his throat dry. "Then they know everything." Keitel looked away, jaw clenched. "More than we do. They have more intelligence on Berlin now than our own command network." Another officer stepped forward. "Sir, we've confirmed at least 5 new air corridors have been used. Repeatedly. Always under Mustang escort." Kruger swallowed. "They're preparing a final strike." "They're carving us open," Keitel said. "And the worst part? We helped them. Every time we failed to shoot one down, it came back with more." The room fell into silence. Finally, Keitel stepped closer, voice lower, dead serious. "Dr. Kruger, I didn't bring you here to report findings. I brought you here because we need to know something. Urgently. What else did that aircraft carry?" Kruger hesitated. His mind flashed back to the chip, the hidden transmitter, the signs of electronic coordination far beyond current German capability. "There was something," he said carefully. "A communications device. Not standard. Possibly linked to a wider strike network. Could it guide bombs? Possibly, or worse, coordinate timing between squadrons." Keitel's face darkened. "They're not just coming to bomb Berlin." "No," Kruger whispered. "They're coming to erase it." Keitel stared at him for a long moment, then turned to his staff. "Begin full evacuation protocols. Silent orders. No broadcasts, only trusted channels. We have 72 hours at most." "Sir?" someone asked. "Evacuate to where?" Keitel didn't answer. He just walked to the nearest map and stared at the red circles drawn by the enemy. And in the quiet that followed, Kruger realized the truth he had feared all along. Berlin wasn't losing the war. Berlin had already lost. The fire lit up the Berlin skyline like a warning written in flame. Kruger and Vogel stood in the alley just beyond the hatch, breaths fogging in the cold night air, hearts pounding. The sound of distant gunfire echoed off stone buildings, sharp cracks that didn't match German rifles. Somewhere out there, American boots were already on the ground. Not in uniform, not in columns, but in shadows. "They're not taking the city," Vogel said under his breath, eyes wide. "They're breaking it." Kruger's eyes tracked the low-flying aircraft sweeping past the horizon. No sirens, no flak, just silent engines moving like razors through the air. He finally understood. This wasn't a bombing campaign. It was a surgical dismantling, quiet, internal, precise. "They're making Berlin useless," Kruger whispered. "Not worth defending, not worth capturing." A distant explosion cut him off, somewhere near the old Gestapo archives. Seconds later, the power grid across 2 city blocks blinked out. The entire eastern quarter of Berlin went dark. Vogel clutched his coat tighter. "What do we do now?" Kruger looked around. The bunker was behind them, sealed, panicked, compromised. The streets ahead were crawling with patrols that couldn't tell friend from infiltrator. But he had to get the last piece of evidence to someone who would listen. Someone who hadn't been corrupted by delusion. "There's one place left," Kruger muttered. "Tempelhof Airfield. If the Americans are using these air corridors, The Luftwaffe will try to intercept. They'll be monitoring the skies. Maybe someone there will believe me. You want to walk across a burning city? Vogel said, incredulous. No, Kruger said. I want to run. They moved fast, cutting through alleys and shattered tram lines. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a carcass. Streetcars lay frozen mid-track. Telephone lines drooped like nooses. Even the propaganda posters had peeled away from the walls, leaving behind pale ghosts of Führers and fallen promises. And then they saw it. Near the Ministry building, a small German convoy, trucks overturned, soldiers dead. Not bombed, shot. Cleanly, silently. One still had his weapon half raised, a look of confusion frozen on his face. Execution style, Vogel whispered. Kruger stepped closer, examining the kill marks. No blood splatter, small caliber, suppressed. 2 bullets each. They're trained, Kruger muttered. Not just regular soldiers, special operations. Elite. A sudden movement. Both men spun. In the shadow of a doorway, a man emerged, cloaked in black, a scarf covering his face, rifle slung low. He didn't speak, just raised his hands. Kruger stiffened. Not German. The man stepped forward and pulled the scarf down just enough to reveal his face. Young, cold eyes. An American accent when he finally spoke. You don't want to be here. Vogel raised his hands instinctively. We're not soldiers, scientists. The man didn't lower his weapon. Then you're not my target. Move north. Avoid the rails. Don't use the lights, Kruger swallowed. You're here already. All of you? The man said nothing, just locked eyes with Kruger. And in that silence, everything was confirmed. Kruger stepped forward, trembling, holding the transmitter chip in his hand. You dropped this? The man looked at it, not surprised, not impressed. I know, he said. You were meant to find it. He turned and disappeared into the alley before either of them could ask more. Vogel turned to Kruger, stunned. What did he mean? Kruger's hands went cold. We weren't supposed to stop them. We were supposed to witness it. It was all theater. All of it. The Mustang. The transmitter. The perfect wreckage. It was never about secrecy. It was about sending a message straight to the heart of the Reich. We see you. We can reach you. We decide when it ends. Kruger and Vogel kept running. Behind them, more explosions, fires, shouts. Ahead, only one thought remained in Kruger's mind. Berlin is no longer a battleground. It's a grave. They reached Tempelhof just before dawn. The sky over Berlin was smeared with smoke and the kind of red that didn't come from sunrise. From a distance, the airfield looked deserted. But that illusion shattered the moment they neared the perimeter. Dozens of Luftwaffe soldiers patrolled the grounds nervously. Flak cannons pointed toward the heavens, though the real threat was no longer coming from above. Kruger raised his hands, shouting over the wind. Dr. Helmut Kruger, I have urgent intelligence. Open the gate! One of the guards aimed his rifle, but an officer in a long coat stepped out of the hangar and waved them through. His name was Oberst Hahn, and Kruger recognized him immediately. A strict man, but not a fool. Inside the hangar, the scene was frantic. Maps strewn across tables. Radios buzzing in 5 languages. Pilots in flight suits stood waiting for orders that no longer made sense. A giant board marked with intercept priority had been hastily crossed out and overwritten with one terrifying phrase: no safe airspace. Kruger didn't waste time. He slammed the transmitter chip down on the nearest table. They've landed agents in Berlin. Not bombers, not fighters, people. They're inside the city. They've taken out radio towers, depots, trains. This wasn't an air raid. It was an infection. Hahn stared at him, face grim. We've lost all contact with the northern radar stations. Flak command is down. Entire comms grid is blind. And it's not a mistake, Kruger snapped. It's part of their plan. They didn't just want to destroy us. They wanted us to know it before it happened. He laid out the composite shard, the maps, the intercepted flight patterns, all of it. Then he looked Han dead in the eye. They gave us just enough to figure it out. Too late to stop it. Vogel added, we ran into one, an American. He spared us, told us to leave, like he knew we'd be the ones to tell the story. Han stared at the shard, running a gloved hand over its surface. We thought they'd bomb Berlin to rubble, he muttered. But this is worse. Outside, the whine of jet engines started. The last functional squadron was preparing for launch, pilots strapping into Me-262s with desperation, not pride. Kruger moved to the edge of the hangar and stared across the tarmac. For the first time, he truly saw what Berlin had become. Not a capital, not a symbol, a warning, and above it all, cutting silently across the smoky sky, another unmarked Mustang cruised overhead, low, slow, unchallenged. No shots fired, no panic, because there was no one left to stop it. It was flying the way a victor does, not in combat, but in ownership. Kruger turned back to Han. You won't stop them. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. This isn't war anymore. This is a transition. To what? Han asked, almost breathless. Kruger didn't answer right away. Then, finally, to the world after Berlin. Suddenly, a comms officer burst in, pale as ash. Message from the Reich Chancellery. Sir? Han took the slip, read it, then crushed it in his fist. Kruger watched him closely. What is it? Hitler is gone, Han said. Disappeared. No official word. No command. The words hit the room like a detonation. The last thread holding the Reich together had snapped. Outside, the Mustang turned gently over the skyline, then disappeared behind the rising smoke. Kruger took one final look at the sky and whispered to no one in particular. They didn't destroy Berlin. They outgrew it. And in that moment, as the city crumbled beneath its own lies, the cold corridors of the bunker echoed with hurried footsteps, muffled arguments, and the low hum of desperation. Orders barked in clipped tones bounced off the concrete walls, but even the shouting couldn't mask the growing fear. The kind of fear that didn't scream, it whispered, spreading through the ranks like rot. Kruger stood in the corner of the command room, watching the chaos unfold. He had never felt more out of place. Soldiers talked strategy, officers debated routes and logistics, but none of it mattered. Not really. He had seen what they hadn't. The technology inside that Mustang. The level of coordination. The sheer scale of it. The war wasn't turning. It had already turned. Now, it was just a question of how deep the Americans would strike, and how much of Germany they planned to leave behind. A low-ranking communications officer approached him quietly, looking pale and hesitant. Herr Doctor, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Kruger followed him through a narrow hallway, unsure what to expect. When the door opened, he found Vogel standing there, soaked from rain, boots caked with mud, eyes wild. Vogel? What in God's name? They're not just using fighters, Vogel said, cutting him off. I've seen it. They've started flying modified bombers, with Mustang engines mounted under the wings. Smaller, faster, low visibility. We found one near Magdeburg, painted like a decoy. Except it wasn't. It carried something. Something I don't think even you've seen. Kruger's blood ran cold. What did it carry? Vogel opened a small case he'd carried on his back. Inside was a piece of black metal, perfectly shaped, smooth, almost surgical. Kruger lifted it gently. This isn't aviation grade. It's composite, Kruger muttered. This hasn't even been seen on our prototypes. Exactly, Vogel said. They're flying tech 5 years ahead of us. Maybe more. We always thought the Americans were behind in innovation. We thought we were superior, but they've been playing a longer game. Kruger looked at the shard, then at Vogel. You said it was from a bomber? Vogel nodded. But there were no bombs. That stopped Kruger in his tracks. What do you mean? There were no payloads. Just wiring, guidance systems, some kind of sensor array. And the entire bottom half was hollow. It was carrying something. Kruger suddenly understood. Not something, he whispered. Someone. He ran back to the command room, case in hand. Burst through the door, startling the officers. Keitel turned, ready to bark, but Kruger cut in before he could speak. They've been landing inside our borders. The room froze. Kruger placed the metal piece on the table. This is stealth-grade composite. They're modifying bombers, disguising them and landing them deep in German territory. Low altitude. Night flights, no bombs, because they're carrying men. Probably commandos, saboteurs. Keitel stared at the shard, then back at Kruger. You're saying they've already begun infiltration? Yes, and it's working. Radar isn't picking them up. Our perimeter's blind. One of the officers leaned in. My God, you think they're here now? Kruger nodded grimly. They're softening the ground. Disabling comms. Mapping bunkers. Berlin won't be bombed into surrender. It will be taken from the inside out. Keitel turned to his staff. Shut down all non-essential channels. Increase patrols in every major city. Interrogate any unverified personnel. No exceptions. A second later, the power flickered. Not for long. Just a blink, but long enough for every man in the room to notice. What was that? Keitel barked, a voice from the back. Generator surge, sir. No, Kruger said softly. It's begun. He looked again at the Mustang's radio chip in his case, at the metal shard on the table, and the photographs of their broken capital. They're already inside, he said. The next 2 hours moved like a fever dream. Alarms rang. Phones screamed. Officers stormed out of rooms with folders clutched tight to their chests. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. That subtle shift from control to collapse. Dr. Kruger, clutching the Mustang's transmitter in his pocket, moved through the corridors like a man walking inside a dying machine. Every door he passed opened to whispers of sabotage. A fuel depot near Potsdam had exploded in the night. A train full of troops bound for the Eastern Front had vanished off the rails. A radio tower on the outskirts of Berlin had gone silent after reporting foreign footsteps in its hallway. Vogel stayed at his side, sweating, twitchy, always looking over his shoulder. You think they're in the city already? I don't think, Kruger said, his voice low. I know. He led Vogel into one of the storage rooms, locking the door behind them. The lights buzzed overhead. There, Kruger laid out everything they had so far. The drop tank schematics, the range calculations, the chip, the composite shard, and worst of all, the map he'd been quietly marking in the command center. The red dots had started as bombing runs. Now they were patterns, clusters, formations. Vogel leaned over the map, staring hard. This isn't random. They're not just hitting infrastructure. They're circling it. Kruger tapped the center, Berlin, then the outer dots, all now within a tightening loop. Encirclement, not with tanks this time, but with planes, commando drops, and aerial intelligence. Every piece is precise. The Mustang wasn't a marvel of flight. It was a messenger. Vogel looked at him sharply. You said that once before, that it wasn't here to fight. It came to deliver something. Kruger nodded slowly, eyes hollow. A signal, a test, to measure our blind spots, our reaction times. And now that they've mapped it all, they've begun the real operation. Suddenly, the lights cut out. Total blackness. Then, a single red bulb flickered to life. A moment later, the sirens. Not for an air raid. This one was internal. Security breach. They burst from the room into a hallway already full of armed guards scrambling to seal doors. The bunker had turned into a hive of panic. One officer shouted down the corridor, "Two men in Luftwaffe uniforms passed the checkpoint. No ID." They didn't respond to challenge. Gunfire rang out. Just a few shots. Close. Vogel ducked instinctively. Kruger froze. Then the voice on the loudspeaker crackled to life, trembling. Saboteurs in the compound. Repeat. Enemy agents inside the Tiergarten command bunker. Kruger looked at Vogel. "They're not coming. They're here." Chaos exploded. Two soldiers ran past them screaming for backup. Another pulled the fire alarm and shouted for everyone without a weapon to shelter in the archive rooms. But Kruger didn't move. He was thinking, not panicking, calculating. If the Americans had reached this deep, it meant one thing. "This isn't just infiltration," he whispered. "It's the start of a blackout.